First of all, I would like to acknowledge and celebrate the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respects to the elders past and present. And this acknowledgement, I think, will take on extra significance as we listen to Anne's talk. The W.H. Hancock Chair is a position that recognises the excellence of Australian history at the ANU and commemorates the role that Sir Keith Hancock played both as a major figure in the discipline of history and in the foundation of the ANU itself, and indeed the foundation of the Research School of Social Sciences. Hancock is widely regarded as the leading historian of the British Empire and Commonwealth of his time. He also wrote pioneering environmental history and was a great advocate of interdisciplinarity in history. As one of 4 leading academics appointed to found the university, he effectively created the Research School of Social Sciences during his directorship, and it is an honour to me that I, in fact, inherit this position from him as the director. And he established the Research School with an emphasis on interdisciplinary social science collaboration and the importance of balancing empirical focus with conceptual breadth and historical scale. He later played a leading role in the establishment of the Australian Dictionary of Biography, which is also a great ANU institution. Anne will say some more about Hancock in her lecture. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Anne McGrath. Anne is the first woman to hold the W.K. Hancock Distinguished Professor in the School of History. She's also the director of the new Research Centre for Deep History, which is clearly related to the lecture that we will see tonight. She holds the ARC Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Fellowship. She's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and the Academy of Humanities. She has a quite remarkable suite of academic honours to her name. Her publications include Born in the Cattle, Aborigines in Cattle Country, which won the inaugural W.K. Hancock Prize of the Australian Historical Association. And more recently, her book Illicit Love, Interracial Sex and Marriage in the United States and Australia, which was awarded the New South Wales Premier's History Prize. She's also produced and directed the films Frontier Conversation and Message from Mungo, and has worked with museums, contributed to national inquiries, and has played a leading role in the in the discipline of history and in the life of the nation. So it is a great honour to introduce Professor McGrath.
I wish to firstly honour the deep history of the Ngunnawal Ngambri people and their ancestors in the country upon which they have lived, walked and loved across space and time. They inhabited an inspirited landscape. They engaged in their own modes of historical practice, their own historicities. I'm honoured to receive their support, and I acknowledge their many generations of storytellers and artists. Today is National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children's Day, so I dedicate this lecture to all the kids and especially our grandchild Bowie. I'm privileged to hold this chair following the inspiring historians that I've been able to work with, including Barry Higman, Tom Griffiths and Ken Inglis, and to be working with a wonderful team, too many to name my wonderful team. I do wish to include a special acknowledgement for my husband Milton Cameron for his support. Given Hancock's advocacy of women's appointments in setting up ANU, because I have been reading his letters and unfortunately they were unsuccessful efforts in the 1940s, I think I could say that he would be pleased to see a woman take up the chair. W.K. Hancock was an innovator in the study of Commonwealth history on a large scale and on a micro, local, regional scale. He was an activist for environmental causes. He actually tried to stop Black Mountain Tower up there going. Unsuccessful. He had a lot of success in his career nonetheless. And he was a charming and self-critical writer with a sense of irony and humour. He also advocated interdisciplinarity. Visiting ANU's Hancock Library, I saw Hancock on thousands of book spines, but unfortunately his own books were not there. I wonder why. Well, it's a science library, that's why. And there's still a chasm between the social sciences and humanities over this side of Sullivan's Creek and the sciences over there. In an attempt to bridge the chasm between science and history, our Laureate Program, Rediscovering the Deep Human Past. So this is our web page. You just look up re.anu.edu.au and you can find out about our collaborating scholars and our advisory council, our main aims and so forth. In approaching the field of deep history, it's absolutely crucial to do interdisciplinary work. For this is a history that demands conversations between the humanities, the sciences and Indigenous knowledges. W.K. Hancock's 1930 publication Australia was a breakthrough. It made Australia, or at least British Australians, the starting point in the narrative of nation. However, its first sentence, as I said in the abstract, is somewhat jarring today. In an age of Me Too, in an age of the Uluru Statement, Indigenous calls for a treaty and truth-telling. On the one hand, as I noted in the weekend's 71st anniversary panel for ANU's anniversary, his first chapter, nonetheless, is called The Invasion of Australia. Now, under John Howard, when I was working for the National Museum of Australia, the term invasion was virtually prohibited. So to think he actually started out his book in 1930 with this term, I think, says something. Hancock had a sense of humanity towards the sad fate of Aborigines, but also a sense of fait accompli, offering much praise for the adventurous men like John MacArthur, who he dubbed the founder of the nation. The father of the nation, was it? And also the early explorers and sheep farmers. In searing prose, however, he wrote of how Australians might shed an economical tear for Aborigines. As an economic historian, I think that had special weight. The title of Hancock's autobiographical book, Country and Calling, about the profession of history versus his sense of patriotism and obligation to come back to his nation, Australia, and to help build the National University, covers a different kind of quandary. Indigenous is one of his first autobiographical account. It's called Country and Calling, and even that country has a different meaning today because Aboriginal people have now taken control of that word, and it's a word about sovereignty, their sovereignty in the country. It's a very meaningful word. It's about their authority over place, and it teaches everyone more than that, about their embedded connectedness in an inscribed human landscape, humanised, peopled landscape, stretching through deep time into the future. In the Uluru Statement, Indigenous people from around Australia called for a full reckoning of their history from time immemorial, both according to their own beliefs from creation time and acknowledging scientific reckonings too. The concept of calling can be a literal one too, as former student Minru Hokari was informed by the Gurindji elders. Country, they told him, had called you here to Gurindji lands, and you are to take our thinking to the world. Minru responded, but I didn't hear anything. And they instructed, you need to wake up your mind to be able to hear it, to speak to you. Country speaks, it teaches. Yet suppressed by colonial onslaughts, today's land, landscapes and languages often need to be woken up. Mirroring Hancock's autobiographical reflections, I will include reference to some of my own historical journeys in this lecture too, and primarily discuss the challenges of expanding historical methodologies for deep history. So what is deep history? Even Amanda Vanstone asked me this question. We aim to expand history's periodisation into deep time and beyond the of prehistory. But more than that, we want to appreciate Indigenous temporality, the every-when of continuities as well as ruptures. We want to question what constitutes historical evidence and knowledge, not just objectivity versus subjectivity, but is evidence itself object or subject? This lecture reflects upon the insights and gaps between scientific humanities and Indigenous knowledge system, and seeks out what kinds of methodologies that history and historians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, might aim to develop. So in order to do this, I thought, well, I'll look at one big turning point story, because historians like turning points, and this will be the theme of discoveries and arrivals, early migration narratives. And the second big theme is everyday life, which I want to reflect on via rock art. Before venturing into deep history, we should become more self-conscious of how bound we are by monumental discovery narratives, as I call them, and their European starting points in those periodisations that start in 1770 and 1788. Because even though there's been very rich work done in the field of Aboriginal history in Australia since the late 1970s, we still tend to be bound by the beginning dates that are European dates for our starting points. So we need to ask why the dichotomy between history that's valued, such as the Captain Cook statue, even though Captain Cook never went to Hyde Park, and after he visited Botany Bay, this was erected 109 years later. But as you can see, the pandemic had already started in this photo last year. And of course, the familiar unfortunate tragedy of Juukan Gorge, which, even though here was history 40,000 years where families had resided and lived their lives, this was not really valued by Australians. So hopefully that horror might be a turning point. Indigenous peoples all over the world have been considered history's outsiders. Their ancient Indigenous pasts have been either excluded from historical narratives or positioned as before history proper began. On this continent, it's as if history had to wait for James Cook to arrive before it could commence. Although there's wonderful work by archaeologists and other scientists and ethnographers, in both academic and popular understandings of the history discipline, Australia's deep human past has not been adequately integrated into the telling of national history. Is it because of its vast temporal and geographical expanse that seems incommensurable, or are we simply unable to be accommodated inside history's relatively modern ambit? Egypt, Greece or Rome seem to be the usual limits of ancient history. At a time when it was still an innovation to write a book about Australian history at all, Australian historian Ernest Scott spoke of the filling of the blank spaces on the map. Today, this may seem a tired Eurocentric cliche, but I would argue that it is a powerful and enduring visualisation of nation. And I thought it's interesting that sandstone still has such meaning, semiotic meaning, as associated with knowledge at universities, whereas focusing on rock art, different type of stone, engraved into deep history. Maybe we should think more about that. The first chapter of Scott's book, Short History of Australia, is entitled The Dawn of Discovery, a powerful visual metaphor about time and about beginnings. He reproduces several maps in his preface and praises the newly published Australasian School Atlas. Mapping was a key way of visualising the world and of nation. And you might notice Australia, which got to be called the fifth continent, was not actually discovered by Europeans at that time. This map was made in 1598. And then, of course, we have the different explorers visiting Australia, and gradually Australia, the shape of the current day continent, becomes known. But then historians and geographers started to fill in the blank spaces on the map with explorers' journeys, the navigators, the overland explorers. This actually combines both, the navigators and the overland explorers. But this one is the kind of thing I saw on the school classroom walls when I was growing up. These the blank spaces carefully filled in by the famous heroes of Australia, the white male explorers who traversed the land. So it was as though this blank landscape was an unstoried place. There was a gap in the map of the world and a gap in history that had to be filled by historians. Then there's a very different, now increasingly familiar map that means a lot in terms of the many different nations that inhabited Australia and the different languages. But it's also a global story. And in a recent book that I co-edited with Lynette Russell, we've actually tried to integrate Australian Indigenous history and into a global story, because we do feel that Indigenous people have been history's outsiders around the globe. And this includes team members Laura Rademacher and Ben Silverstein, who contributed chapters. And then there's this other map that is the deep history map of Australia during the Pleistocene and the Holocene. And we're starting to learn about how Australia that we know today, the continent we know today, was actually joined to New Guinea, often called Sahul, but of course that has the name has a history as well. Working against the prevailing narratives, in 1969, in his Prehistory of Australia, John Mulvaney used an all-capitals leading sentence to proclaim the discoverers, explorers and colonists of the 3 million square miles which are Australia were its Aborigines. Researching the first arrivals and routes to Australia has been an important area of research for archaeologists and associated specialists. Nonetheless, Indigenous first arrival stories lack the prerequisites for classification as discovery narratives. Can something that happened that long ago be a historical event at all? Discovery as a word and concept in English has become very much overlaid with the imperial imagination, asserting sovereignty over lands previously unknown to Europeans. Going back to papal law, it was a European means of asserting rights to territory. European discovery of other places did mark a historical rupture, a major turning point, a symbolic moment after which nothing could ever be the same. For Europe, much of the world would no longer remain unknown. For Indigenous people, colonialism presented a rupture of great magnitude. But sovereignty, to be legally recognised, must be performed. So raising flags, renaming places, doing discovery reenactments are demonstrations that all matter. Telling history stories is one of these too. History's narratives, its very plot lines, its beginning dates, have long reinscribed British assertions of sovereignty in Australia. Despite our increasing knowledge and understanding Indigenous history, I feel that historians, including myself, have been stuck inside the periodisations of the monumental discovery narratives of 1770 and 1788. Dates matter to historians. We do like to identify a relevant turning point, a beginning date and an end date. And yet, in global history, Australia is a very unique example. After the research in Mudjabbibi, we have a date of 65,000 years for Aboriginal occupation. We don't know where, that could go further back. Indigenous Australians lived on the continent when it was like this. In that sense, the language map is not covering that time. And Aboriginal narrators have been telling their own stories of the ancient past for aeons, and they still are. European discovery did not mean that Indigenous sovereignty or Indigenous history had ended. Additionally, archaeologists, geomorphologists, dating scientists and other specialists have the technical expertise to ascertain remarkable results in their research. New injections of funding have greatly advanced archaeological practice, which increasingly is led by Aboriginal elders and communities. Historians, including Indigenous historians and members of our advisory committee, such as Lorena Barker and Jackie Troy, are taking up the challenge of projects that track their people's songs and songlines, which would be rather different journey routes than the ones you just saw then of the explorers, and their journey routes that would have continued for millennia rather than just being a few days in a spot. In my research at Lake Mungo, and I do see that co-director of the film, Andrew Pike, is in the audience, so that's great. I've worked with the Muddy Muddy Nyampa and Barkindji people of Lake Mungo, along also with Malcolm Albrook, and they taught me so much. What historians, such as myself, would see as a great chasm of time, for example, since Mungo Lady lived 40,000 years ago and today, the local elders did not see as a chasm at all. They talked about her as though she'd only died yesterday. The past was immediate and revelatory to them. They were inspired by Lady Mungo surfacing. They saw it happened for a purpose, for them. They understood her as a living presence in the landscape today, changing lives, shaping the weather, shaping what people did and didn't do. They talked about her like an old auntie that they knew. Dates were not considered particularly relevant. They talked instead of an eternal multi-layered present of an everywhen rather than of a distant past. So in the film we did show the conflicts and the contrasting thinking between scientists and Indigenous custodians. And this topic of reburial is still very fraught. A federal government decision pending next week, if not this week. But it's another example of how Australia as a nation doesn't really value this deep past, because there's not even a very decent interpretation centre. There's a tiny little visitors centre at Lake Mungo, even though it's World Heritage. Mati Mati elder Alice Kelly called for a change when she heard the scientists had taken the human remains of her ancestors away to ANU actually. Archaeologist Isabel McBride too realised things had to change if there was to be any chance of reconciliation. Their interventions led to great change in the nation, joint management, new heritage legislation. But people also started to realise for reconciliation, the narratives of discovery had to also change. So the scientists were basically quite proud of themselves as the new discoverers. And like the European ocean navigators and explorers, they were discovering not a continent, but a lost world, that of the Aboriginal past. An opportunity to share this treasured discovery narrative came up in 2003. For an amazing trackway of human footprints had been found. 7,000 of them were identified. They're now dated at 20,000 years ago in the Pleistocene. So once again, Australia's deep human past is jumping the Anthropocene, the Holocene, and is actually occurring during the Pleistocene era. The immediacy of these footprints was really mind-blowing. That, you could see where little children had gambled around playing, you could see people were running and hunting, and amazingly you could see that one man was getting around very fast on one leg. So once again, that caring, that beautiful caring, and also the way the little children were carrying on, not going in one direction but circling around and having fun. It was very moving for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people to be directly connected with that. It happened that Mary Pappen Jr., a Mati Mati woman who was also a discovery ranger working for national parks, was the first to spot those footprints according to the scientists who were there. So the national parks was very keen to say, oh, now we have an Aboriginal woman has actually discovered an amazing thing about the ancient past. So it was like they were wanting to share the discovery narrative. But it didn't go over very well. Mary Pappen did not ever take the credit for being the discoverer, even though the media wanted to play that up and national parks. It's hardly surprising when the discovery narrative was probably something she had to put up with at school, where she was told Captain Cook discovered Australia and therefore your granny's lying about having been here before him. But it's more than that too, because they felt that those footprints had always been there, and they felt that elders had seen them before, but they didn't want to talk about them. They didn't want to make them so public, and that they were not seen as evidence for science, but rather a direct connection, as though the elders were surfacing and speaking to them in the present. Now, there's been a lot of interesting research going on into Australia's first arrivals, and these amazing articles have been published in Nature and Nature Communications, and they talk about superhighways that Aboriginal people would have taken. They use a I knew I wouldn't be able to say that word, anyway, whatever. It's a random model of variables and huge data. Like, they actually tested 125 billion potential pathways. That's big data for you. And get Gouldy and David Armitage onto that. I do believe David was going to listen via Zoom, so hello, David, at Harvard. That kind of data is very different from a historian's modus operandi. Noel Butlin aside, historians these days don't tend to consider such modelling techniques. The scientists involved in the superhighways work combined ancient water table information, significant landscape features, and archaeological sites. Here's all the archaeological sites, creating a series of different maps, then combining them. Although very sophisticated, they never looked at the DNA evidence, the linguistic evidence, and more importantly, they didn't look at the accounts by Aboriginal people of their own migration narratives. Is there a point at which the science being done about the deep past might meet with history? That is, to inform more comprehensive understandings of the past. Ngarrindjeri man David Unayapon point out some ways we can do this. He was lauded as an Aboriginal genius. It's interesting, in 1914, the British Association for the Advancement of Science actually came to Australia. There were all these incredible geneticists and anthropologists and geologists and people from many different fields actually came on ships during the war as well. So it's quite a story, and Lynette Russell's actually put together a collection about this story. But during this time, Unayapon, who had grown up on Point Macleay Mission, or Raukan, Lake Alexandrina, he had read philosophy and physics, and he was really excited by the age in which he lived and its new scientific thinking. He celebrated modernity. In one letter to a fellow scientist, he wrote, "We are living in a wonderful age in which the world has a wonderful progress in commerce, science and art. What wonderful discoveries and inventions." He was a very eloquent writer and rarely used the same word so many times, but I love this because it just sounds like he's so excited about the scientific developments of the day. But he also decided to share his knowledge, and he was asked really to give talks all around Australia, in Sydney, Melbourne, Tasmania, Adelaide, lots of little towns all over the place as well. And he even spoke in cathedrals, and he spoke about Indigenous migration stories, where Aboriginal people came from. They're in the newspapers. And he also wanted to go to this meeting to meet these famous scientists when they came to Australia. And he wrote a letter to Herbert Baysdale, who was a great mentor of him, and said he would like to meet. When the group of scientists actually went to Lake Alexandrina, and the Ngarrindjeri people did boomerang displays and dances and so on. But for some reason, Unayapon does not seem to have been there. It was not reported that he was there. And I'm still trying to look at the photos from that time, but it seems very mysterious to me that he was not. When he did go to Melbourne, which was where a lot of the events happened as well, he was actually staying in the premises that were owned by the scientific societies. So he was recognised as a scientist, but I'm just sort of wondering what happened with all this. At the time, Aboriginal people were seen as primitive. In this book by Solis about, what was it called? The other people there were also Balfour, the director of the Pitt Rivers Museum at Oxford, and there are quite a lot of leading scientists from Oxford and Cambridge. Now, Solis's book was called Ancient Hunters and Modern Representatives, with a whole chapter on Aboriginal people. So they were of great interest to scientists and geneticists at the time. But Uniapon was actually going around talking about how his people got to Lake Alexandrina. He talks about them coming from the northwest, and whence came the Abos, as this thing was called. But he goes into quite a bit of detail. He says, all the tribes in South Australia agree that we originally came out of the northwest, struck the Darling River and followed it down to Lake Alexandrina. We did not all come at once, but came in waves, and we preserved the names of the tribes and the order in which they came. And he then gives the names of the different tribes, the names of their leaders, and the meanings of each tribe is associated with where they came from and who arrived first. So there's actually conflict between the different groups and assertions of who was going to live in what areas of land. And people say, well, how did you come from so far away? And he explained that they knew all the directions and they had words for the directions, so they had a strong sense of where they were going. And they also, he also talked about this place called Lulupoon Colt, and he said this was an isthmus. It was joined up but also broken. So he seemed to have a clear idea of the continent being joined up in a way that it's not currently joined up. And then people said to him, well, why did they come? And he said, oh, they were being chased by, in the stories that I've been handed down by my father and his grandfather, they were being chased by giant ants, fierce ants. And he said this could be a metaphor, because he is very aware of mythological accounts, of epic narratives, or perhaps it was a people that were as numerous as ants. But there was another people that sort of chased them into the land. So I do find all this very fascinating, and just find it a shame that the scientists who looked at these billions and billions of variables didn't also look at the accounts by Aboriginal people such as David Uniapon, which were actually becoming fairly well known around 1914. I also went to Iatsis and listened to David Uniapon talking to a linguist, Catherine Ellis. And that was really fascinating, because it was clear later in life, when he became older, he had totally rejected Christianity, even though it was often the church groups that were his sponsors earlier in life. He said, how could you say that? Why would it have been the British brought God to Australia? For heaven's sake, God was already here in our country. And he already knew about the Milky Way and the galaxies and the stars. And poor old Catherine Ellis was trying to get him to translate the Bible. So she said, okay, tell me in your language, how do you say in the beginning? And he said, there was no beginning. Look at the galaxies, look at the stars. And he knew the words of Milky Way was Nepali, and he talked about all that, and talked about, something that sounds like black holes and so on. And then she says, all right, tell me how you would say, let there be light. And he said, and so he started talking about it, and she said, like yellow light coming through. He goes, haven't you heard of the prism and all the multiple colours of light? Light isn't yellow. And so he's sort of putting you in a place, but always using Indigenous knowledge to do this. And on this segue of colour, which he brought to the party, I want to talk a little bit also about rock art. Just out of interest, this place Lemuria was considered in the 1910s and 20s as a lost continent like Atlantis, and geographers talked about it. They didn't have the same knowledge of global plates and so forth that we have today. And so Uniapon actually talked about this other land that he came from as Lemuria, as an English translation to the other stories I was telling you. And Rudolf Steiner was a great advocate of Lemuria as this incredible place where there were no sexes. There were also theories about Aboriginal people having been a superior race, but then they became degraded and they then had genders and everything went bad after that. But I did promise some reflexive historical work about my own journey as a historian in the spirit of Hancock. So this is me with Ros Fraser on a trip by ANU alumni Daryl Lewis actually took me there to Kakadu. It must have been about 1979, and Ros Fraser I met at the National Archives. That was my first sighting of amazing rock art around Aburi Rock. And this I show because I just wanted to show you that the Australian National University helped me with my PhD. You see, I hired these cheap cars from the North Australia Research Unit that were not four-wheel drive, so they got bogged easily. But anyway, thank you, ANU. And when I first went, I think that my first trip to Darwin, I was so influenced by this world that Xavier Herbert had told about, and he even had a map in Capricornia of his imagined fiction world that he portrayed in Capricornia. At the time there were no histories written of the Northern Territory, except there was one by Slim Bow about agricultural history. So the next time I saw rock art was really incredible. It was with an anthropology group at the Darwin Community College, and it was led by an Indigenous expert whose name I can't give you, but that was the first time I experienced a welcome. It was so profound. He stood there and he shouted out in language. We were on this high, rocky sort of plateau that we'd been landed on in the helicopter, and he shouted out in language, and we sort of going, and it echoed back, and we sort of, what's going on? And he said, well, I'm calling out in language to these spirits so that you don't get bitten by a snake, so you don't fall down and break your leg. It was very beautiful, that traditional welcome. And of course it was stunning country that Aboriginal people lived in when they made this beautiful rock art. So I first met Xavier Herbert in the Kungaranakai Maramanungu land claim. I was actually asked to be an expert witness, even though I was just doing my PhD. It was very intimidating. And you'll see Xavier Herbert sitting there, and I was trying to look like an old maid because I was only sort of 21 or something, so I was trying to look sort of more sophisticated. And once again, the land claim was all about a map, a topographical map that Aboriginal people then had to identify. But on a trip we did together in Kakadu, which was related to that film, The Frontier Conversation, it was about 2005, Pitjantjatjara man Gordon Briscoe, who was a historian, one of the first ANU PhD graduates in history. He was Aboriginal. He was the first, I believe. He really treasured historical research. He treasured quantification data. But he was quite blown away when he went to these rock art sites, and he basically proclaimed, this is the closest thing we have to an archive. It should be greatly valued. So I have reflected on that ever since. Is that a valid description? Could historians work out how to critique this particular archive? Certainly it was noticed by the first fleet writers, Arthur Phillip, Watkin Tench, John White and others. They all noticed how much art was around Sydney Cove and Botany Bay. Today, rock art is a very rich field of research. Observation, data collection and scientific pigment and dating analysis have been very important. And other researchers have adopted a more ethnographic approach with a strong interest in the contemporary meanings for local Aboriginal people. My next trip was actually with Xavier Herbert. He rang me when I was in the middle of college break, and I was really hoping to get a chapter done on my PhD. And he after he went back, back to Cairns, Redlich, where he lived, he rang me and he said, "Do you want to come on this trip to the Quincan art galleries with Dick Ruffsey and Percy Trezise?" And I actually was very furious because I thought, everybody's always trying to distract me from doing my PhD and writing this chapter. And so how dare he contact me and just expect me to run off on this trip? Well, of course, my friends had a go at me. They said, "Anne, you must go. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." And I must say, it was very interesting. Xavier Herbert was 79 and his wife, Sadie, had recently died. Anyhow, so after a one-night stopover in Cairns, I did show this. Xavier Herbert then worked with Val McGuinness and a variety of other people in the Finniss River region. That's why he was also called to that claim, and those people were lifelong friends of his. Anyhow, I caught the light plane that Percy Trezise was flying, and before I knew it, he started doing stunts. He started with Loop the Loop, and by the way, there was a dingo in the cockpit with him, next to him, his pet dingo. And then he turned the engine off, and all the male humans who were in the plane at the time, this little tiny plane, were all staring at me. So, "Are you going green, Anne? Are you scared, Anne?" Yes, I was. Anyhow, our first excursion was actually to the gallery that's known as the Magnificent Gallery, and I kept a diary when I went on this trip. I wrote in the diary, "There's a wide variety of cave art, including a lot of decorated figures, some quinkans, female sorcery figures, flying fox, dingoes, etc. Some of the views are just breathtaking. It's got such a different feel to the territory." There wasn't that much that I wrote about the rock art, but I wrote quite a lot about Xavier and Percy. Xavier constantly talks. I wonder whether I've missed a point already covered. In fact, he talks over 70% of the time. Xavier keeps making a fuss whenever I yawn. He says I might be anemic, he thinks, or tired, or perhaps I need to learn to breathe properly so as not to yawn so much. And he had a white powder, he said, was caffeine, which he used all the time, and was trying to get me to take some to wake up more, to listen to him. Percy's such a perfect host, yet sometimes he makes me feel so idiotic being female. He hates academics and says women can't control the heat on open fires. They use too much heat and burn things, as though it's biological. Xavier often corrects him there, playing good cop. He tells Percy I'm intelligent, despite being a woman. But Xavier said that because... he also said that I hadn't yet developed originality because I thought his ideas were way out. So there you go. And then I said, "I feel the PhD is worrying me. Finish the bloody thing, you idiot. Heard a series of Chunda stories over dinner. They want me to give a speech at the art show. I gleefully accepted. They want me to say how great this country is and how great they are." Well, I went and I did say, I really admire Helen Garner for coming out and actually sharing all her diaries like she did. But Percy wore a solar topee when he was on a lot of his excursions discovering rock art sites. So both he and Xavier were also part of this discovery narrative. But at the same time, Percy had relied on Indigenous insights. Through Dick Ruffsey, who was actually a Lardil man, he really wanted to find out what the Kuku Yulanji, the local Indigenous people, had to say about the rock art and the legends, and they weren't interested in talking to him. But Dick Ruffsey managed to be an intermediary and got them interested. And so that's how they wrote all these books of legends. So there's the dingo, there's Dick, Percy and Xavier. And the old days of cameras, they weren't quite as good as today. I also had a wonderful photo of them sort of flexing their biceps, but I'm sorry, I couldn't find it. I spent hours trying to find it. And this was the bush camp that we went on. And these are some of the children's books that Dick and Percy did together of Aboriginal legends from the area. And then more recently, we managed to go on a field trip in the age of COVID. So we were led by, on a trip by one of the local people, Kuku Yulanji, Johnny Murison, and he is actually a descendant of some of the men who took Dick and Percy on these introductory trips to many, many galleries around Quincan Country and Cape York. And this is Mike Jones, a postdoctoral fellow with the project. And this is all the people who went on this wonderful trip, including the stellar Lisa Cooley, who's an astrophysicist, and Mike, and there's Johnny. So I sort of wondered what historians might be able to learn from rock art. If it's not an archive, what is it? Actually, Mike is an archivist, and he told me it's not an archive. But anyway, we'll keep discussing this. The experts, the artists, the scholars, have sophisticated explanatory frameworks, and they offer clues to the dates that rock art was made. Another lying down looking at rock art picture from... And of course the rock art is absolutely stunning. It's so rich. So what might rock art teach us about deep history? As Big Bill Neji explained to Paul Tasson when visiting the elaborate Ubiri rock shelter in Arnhem Land, this one now, history book, said Bill. Good for you, my history. This is why I'm telling you. It was used to express and tell stories of everyday life, of legends, of rituals, practices, medical practices, plants, animals, half-human creatures, the quinkans, the evil spirits, the benign spirits. They're all there in this gallery that's known as the Magnificent Gallery. Of course, there are many different art traditions around Australia and perhaps many different uses of the rock art. And some Aboriginal people, before they visit, they believe that the spirits are busy painting for them before they come. So it's very much not seen as static or something that stopped in the ancient past. But the handed down meanings we might get from Aboriginal people today, they might have been true for 1800 or 1890, but were they true for times 20,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago? We're still trying to work out what questions we might ask of this archive, rock art, this history book. But one thing that really struck me was the incredible overlayering. And I really want to talk to Western art specialists to find out, are there any traditions like this in Western art? You know, it's not like the palimpsest, it's nothing's rubbed out. Things are just layered and layered over the top of each other. There seems to be often no hierarchy, though sometimes there is some important creature like a rainbow serpent that might be high up on a ridge like that, for example, in some overhangs. And sometimes down the bottom there are cute little figures like little dingoes and so on, and I wonder whether they were done for children or whether they were done by children. And there's all the beautiful stencilled hands, and they're very moving to see because, you know, you can see hands that look like they might be from a woman or a big man, and then you see the tiny little ones that almost look like those from a newborn baby, and you get the feeling of whole families being there and this intimate connection with people who have put their hands on this space to be stencilled. We don't, and people might find the date of when it happened, but there's still that sense of immediacy in these incredible places. So to conclude, I did wonder whether this layering might suggest a kind of everywhen, an idea of a multiverse or a eternal time rather than chronological timelines. Deep history promises as a way to think about history a little differently, to build new things perhaps, but to build on our strengths, to experiment with new methodologies for history that will adequately people our continent's past. Whether we wish to focus on the great turning points, the epic and arrival narratives, or the ephemeral moments of everyday lives, deep history introduces major challenges for the history discipline. It requires working with many other disciplinary specialists. It requires engaging with Indigenous modes of historical practice that challenge our discipline's timelines, our sense of periodisation, and the nature of evidence itself. Thanks to Indigenous knowledge sharing since European arrival and our rich institutional archives, we might start to revisualise the human history of the continent. Australia's sandstones and rocky slates too were well and truly marked up. They were storied, painted, repainted, overlaid and sprayed, but not erased, indelible and yet representing an ephemeral moment. We hope that our Digital Atlas project, which Mike is leading, I think I need a drink of water, called Marking Country, will provide a small step towards charting new maps and new visualisations. We hope that it will visualise a different kind of history of Australia, but at the same time, using traditional kind of mapping, it will speak back to the traditional history maps of the continent. Historians' discoveries of Australian history need to go deeper. Like all histories, they don't just exist in the past, they are created in and represent the colours of the present. History is a conversation between present and the past, where we value its benefits for the future. To get this right, it won't be easy, it won't be quick. We will need to think as expansively as possible and to learn from many of our predecessors and collaborators, thinking too on multiple timescales. Thinking also about the macro and the micro, the snap moments in time where perhaps women, men and boys gathered together mixing ochres to spray around their hands. Permanent inscriptions, they belonged, enduring over millennia. Hopefully such efforts might help us to visualise our nation and continent in transformative ways, ones that for our future will make historical journeys beyond the monumental discovery narratives.